So I began writing when I was at drama school, trained to be an actor, and it was a drama school where we were encouraged to create our own theatre. It was called Rose Bruford College, and we were trained to be actors, but we were also encouraged to create our own theatre. And so I began to write then, and I discovered a real love of writing. Baby steps I was taking all those years ago. And when I left drama school, I formed a theatre company called Theatre of Black Women, which was Britain's first such black women's theatre company. And we formed it because we wanted to get work. You know, there was no work for us. People wouldn't employ black women, really. And we wanted also to be at the helm of our own creative process and productivity. So we formed a theatre company and wrote plays for the company. So I then wrote plays for the company. And then I left theatre behind eventually. By the end of my 20s, I wasn't in theatre, but I was continuing to write. And my first book was published in 1994. So writing came to me really through theatre. For a long time, I didn't understand why my natural voice as a writer was poetry. So when I was writing for theatre, I was writing what I call poetry drama. When I published my first poetry book, and then I wrote a couple of verse novels. And I never really understood where it came from, which is a bit ridiculous because actually I had been steeped in poetry from childhood because I grew up in the Catholic Church and I went to Mass every Sunday. I went to my first school for the first 4 years. It was a Catholic school and we had Mass every day. And anybody who knows anything about the Catholic Church or even who has read the Bible, it's incredibly poetic. So that I absorbed that through, poetry was absorbed into me through osmosis from my very early life, from the age of 5. So therefore it wasn't so surprising that when I started to write 4 years after I left the church, that it should come out as poetry. But also I was also doing drama at school. I was doing Shakespeare, Dylan Thomas's Under Milkwood, radio plays, incredibly poetic, was one of the plays I did at school. I love poetry at school, so that was also an inspiration for me. The process of actually writing a novel was a very slow one. So I began writing poetry drama and then I just focused on writing poetry. And then I tried to write a novel, which was going to be my first novel called Lara, which was based on my family history. And I spent 3 years working on it, writing prose, which actually I hadn't really written since I'd left school and I was then in my early 30s. And I was struggling to write this novel because I didn't know how to do it. I didn't understand how to structure a novel. I just didn't know how to do it. So I did write 200 pages, but I think it was terrible writing. And I'd left my poetic voice, I'd kind of like just completely abandoned it. And I wrote this very boring, literal novel that was terribly structured. There was indeed almost no structure to it. And then I decided after 3 years to turn it into poetry, and it became a verse novel. So that was my first novel, but it was a verse novel. And then my second book, The Emperor's Babe, was a collection of poems that I then expanded into another verse novel. And then the next book, Soul Tourist, was written as a prose novel because I didn't want to give up on writing a prose novel. And so I spent 4 years working on it as a novel. And I produced probably about 90,000 words, which was a lot for me. Because when you're writing poetry, you're not actually producing many words. You know, we know how poetry is shaped on the page, and you're not even dealing with word counts when you're writing poetry. It's kind of immaterial, really. So I wrote 90,000 words, and my publisher, it didn't work, it was a mess. And my publisher asked me to redraft it, which was essential. And I put some poetry into the redraft and he said, I like the poetry. And it had been a commission for a straightforward prose novel. But at some stage he said to me, look, you can do what you like with it. If you want to turn it into poetry, that's fine, do what you like with it. Because I think we both understood that it just wasn't working as a prose novel. And it then became a novel with verse, which was a genre I think I've invented. So it was a mixture of poetry, prose poetry, scripts, and also other non-literary devices. So it was a real kind of mishmash of different forms. And then the next book, Blonde Roots, which was published in 2008, was my first prose novel. It began as poetry intentionally. I shaped it on the page as poetry, the first few pages, because I knew that I was going to struggle if I just wrote prose. And then I realigned the text so that it would look like prose, and then wrote the rest of it as prose. Although, compared to a very traditional prose novel, some people tell me it's very poetic. It's my process to capture the voices in my characters and in my poetic style and my prose style changes from book to book. So because I began as a poet, I really pay attention to how language sounds and also to creating interesting sentences even when I'm writing prose. And I like to capture the essence of my characters rather than my books are not sprawling. I think they're very tightly controlled in the way because of my poetic background. And also some of my books are written in the first person. So then it's about capturing the voice of an individual character, which I have to hear in my head. But sometimes the character emerges through the act of writing. So for example, with Mr. Loverman, I based the protagonist Barrington on a passport photograph. And I started writing the voice that I imagined went with this passport photograph, this older Caribbean man from the 1950s, I think. And as I wrote it, the voice emerged. I did not plan to write this character. I did not plan to write a novel. It was an exercise that I was doing. And the voice just came to me. And then when the voice comes to me and I get excited by it, then I know that I can explore it further. And sometimes that would be a whole book length story in the voice of an individual character, or maybe two characters, or maybe several characters.
Do you do that, writing by hand or computer?
Writing by hand, what's that?
I mean,
is that paper? How do you remember paper? Paper and pen, yeah. I used to. So like going back to the 80s, obviously, pretty much most people did, you know, apart from those old typewriters. So I used to write, and also because I began writing poetry, and that is, you really need to write poetry by hand. So yes, I used to write by hand. But then when I was writing like the two verse novels, I began to write it by hand, type it up, and then redraft on the screen. But what I do is let's just say I support a rewilding charity, you know, where they rewild parts of Scotland because I use a lot of paper. So what I do is I print up every draft and I draft constantly. So I'm not the kind of writer who begins at the beginning of a novel and finishes it and then redrafts the whole thing. I redraft every sentence, every word, every paragraph. It's ongoing, and each time I'm tweaking it, I will have printed it up, and I sometimes retweak it on the screen, but often I will also tweak it on the page with pen. And then that's the process for me now. I don't believe in the concept of writer's block. I think to name something as writer's block is kind of misleading, because there's something going on behind that. If you're not able to write, what's going on? Is it a lack of confidence? Is it that your work, if you're writing a novel, maybe you're new to novel writing and it's not structured in such a way that the architecture is not holding up the story, and therefore you don't know what to do with it or where to go? Is there stuff going on in your family that is perhaps affecting your creativity? Should you be working on something else? Should you just put something down and return to it in a week, 2 weeks, 6 weeks, a year, 2 years, 3 years, and start on something else if you want to write? So no, I don't experience writer's block. If, you know, so say with Mr. Loverman, as I said, that voice just came. He came to me, and I knew he was fully formed. And some of the other characters, like with Girl, Woman, Other, some of those characters, I found it harder to get into them. You know, some of them were very easy to write, and I could hear them and feel them and see them, and then others I struggled with a bit, and I had to really work at it. So I have a character in Girl, Woman, Other called Grace, who was born in the 19th century, and there was something for me about writing that character set in the 19th century that created a psychic distance between me and her. And I was treating her too reverently as a character. I wasn't making her fully flesh and blood and complex and flawed and interesting and all those things that I like to make my characters. She was a bit too nice and a bit too complete and a bit too passive. And I had to kind of muck her up a bit. you know, in order for her to then come alive in the way that the other characters had come alive. How you can tell, I think, will probably change from writer to writer. But for me, it is just an instinct I have that it's when I'm excited by a voice, you know, and that excitement can last many years of writing a story and I never get bored of them. And then sometimes I'm sad at the end, you know, with my book, The Emperor's Babe. So she's a black girl who grows up in Roman London nearly 2,000 years ago. But I've created an alternate universe. So she's deeply historical, obviously, but she's also sounds very, very contemporary. And I really, really loved her as a character. And she is a cheeky young woman who has a tragic end, unfortunately. And at the end, when I finished writing her, I really mourned her loss, you know, because she was no longer going to be part of my life. I killed her. She's gone. You know, that was the end of her life. I spent about 18 months, 2 years writing it. And she was with me all the time. And it was a very intense experience. And then gone. So in Girl, Woman, Other, there are these 12 characters, primarily women. One's non-binary. I wrote characters one by one because they all have their own sections, but they also are, you know, there are X degrees of separation between them. There are full mother-daughter relationships. So one character would often lead to the next character. So I knew I wanted to expand the representation of black women in fiction, and I wanted to see how many characters I could create in a single novel, and they were all co-protagonists, so they all have equal weight in the novel. And then I actually started with Carol, who doesn't actually start the book, but she was the first character I wrote. And then I really liked her mother, who came into her story. And so then I gave her mother her own sections. And then she has a friend called Letitia. And at some point I thought, I need a character like Letitia in this book, because I was writing other characters. And then I wrote Letitia's section. And so that was how the book was. That was the process of writing it. One would lead to another, would lead to another. And then I was looking at the fact that the book seemed a bit London-centric, and I didn't want that. So then I set 3 characters living in the north of England. So I was juggling all these things that I wanted to put into the book in terms of the characters, where they came from, what kind of lives they led, what kind of relationships they were in. And I wanted it to be as wide-ranging as feasible in a single novel, where there is some kind of interrelationship between the characters in some way. And so that was the process. And the whole reason I wrote the book, well, I was going to write a book anyway, but it was just to create a novel that is peopled by black women, because there aren't many of us writing these books. And so we're not really very present in British literature. And some people will say to me, yes, but what about this person or that person? But that's usually where it ends. It's like, yeah, there's this person and that person. Is that enough, really? You know, so so that was the ambition at the beginning. You know, it's interesting because one of my earlier books, Lara, is based on my family history. It's a verse novel, and it spans 150 years, 7 generations, 3 countries of my family history. So actually, it is a very ambitious book, but it's very different to Girl, Woman, Other, because that also spans like 120 years or so. But Girl, Woman, Other was published at a time, I think, when there was more attention being paid to black women in society in general. I started the book fully aware that there wasn't a lot of interest in black women's stories, and I thought that's why I'm writing the book, to try and, you know, get people interested in being curious about us and our lives and so on. And then while I was writing the book, the first iteration of Black Lives Matter happened, and also Me Too. And society started to shift. And also because of social media, you know, people were able to have agency and have a platform to explore themselves. You know, black women, all kinds of normally minoritized groups, were able to communicate and create some kind of critical mass on social media that bypassed the traditional media, who traditionally hadn't been very interested in us or our work. And so suddenly it was a really exciting moment in our culture, whereby a book such as Girl, Woman, Other was really topical. It was a really topical book, but that wasn't the intention. It became topical because the society shifted around me during the making of the book. And then I always had big ambitions for my books. but they don't materialize. That doesn't stop me. But then of course, then the Booker happened, and my career went through the roof in a way that I'd wanted it to go through the roof. And suddenly I was being translated into like 40 languages. And it was just like every day there was a different translation, foreign deal coming through, which was just incredible. So I knew that my work was reaching, you know, there are now 60 foreign rights of my different books, because the other books have also come to the fore. And it's just this wonderful feeling that the work is being read in the original languages all over the world. And then it became, Girl, Woman, Other became a bestseller, 44 weeks, you know, and it was the top seller for, I think it was 5 weeks. This is almost unimaginable in British literature, because books by writers of colour very rarely make the bestseller list, let alone staying on the bestseller list for so long. So the book was selling, and it was reaching Middle England. And that is the sort of major book buying popular, what we call Middle England in the UK. And then how people saw me as a writer changed, you know, from one day to the next. Suddenly I was taken extremely serious. I was given this kind of gravitas, which had not been kind of, you know, the case before. And as a writer who's also an activist, who speaks up and speaks out, people were listening to me. And then lots of other opportunities, collaborations and so on came my way. Everything changed, but of course I'm still the girl from Woolwich, right? As J-Lo is still the girl from, what did she say? I'm still Jenny from the hood. I'm still the girl from Woolwich, because this happened to me at the age of 60. So I'm a big old lady who is very established in my creative process, in my relationships, in how I see the world and everything. Asian writers, I think, have had better careers as writers in the UK than black writers. And for a long time, there was a publishing industry that would literally say there is no market for books by black British writers. Not having done any research, by the way, but just assuming that that would be the case. So I think that's how unimportant they saw us. You know, we were just not worthy of being published. And I know people did try to get published and really struggled with it. And the landscape today is very different. I think there's never been a better time for black writers to get published, or writers of colour to get published in Britain. It really is a very, very thriving industry, but we'll see whether it lasts or not. But it's changed over those years. But there were always Asian writers, male Asian writers, always doing well. British writing would be very anemic, really, if it hadn't been infused with writers from other countries and cultures. And often writers who have roots in Africa, Asia or the Caribbean are fresh voices, because they're talking about societies that are often not been written about. And so they're actually injecting a lot of originality and exciting ideas and cultural differences into the body of British literature. You can imagine if British literature is only white, written by white, male, middle-class people, as was the case so long ago, it would be in a state of disrepair. I never gave up, and some people give up and then they pick themselves up again. So as a writer, I never gave up, but there were points in my career where I kind of wondered what was the point, because I was putting everything that I could into my writing, but I wasn't reaching a big readership. When you spend 5 years writing a book and then you maybe sell 5,000 copies, I mean, this is in the British context of the book, it does feel disappointing. Not that I write to reach millions of people, but that would have been nice. And so I have now reached over 1 million people, which is incredible, right? But yeah, there were times when, having been in the arts 40 years, which is, I won the Booker Prize after 40 years, when I just wanted more from my career. I felt that I was producing the work that could reach as many people as possible, but I needed my career to be elevated. I kept going because I developed a very positive mindset many years ago. I did lots of personal development courses that made me always see the positive in things. So I never really allowed myself to sink low, to get depressed. I never get depressed. I never allowed myself to seriously think about giving up. You know, when I talk about the fact that you know, there were moments when I kind of wondered what it was all about. They were moments. It wasn't as if I spent 6 months in a funk because I was kind of like so depressed about my career. And my career was always moving forwards as well. It just wasn't going at the pace I wanted it to go, and it wasn't reaching the destinations that I wanted it to reach. So positive thinking was a great mindset for me. And also the fact that I believe in what I'm working on. I believe in writing the stories about the African diaspora in the way that I have done is very important to me. And I realise that if I give up with my creativity, then I can't complain about other people not doing the work. You know, you have to keep doing the work.